The wind howled across the desolate plains of Caliban, carrying with it the scent of decay and the bitter tang of old blood. Lion L. Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels, stood at the highest point of the fortress monastery, gazing down at the ruins of a world once filled with hope and promise. The stone pillars that had once stood tall as symbols of strength and unity were now broken and eroded by time, their grandeur lost to the ever-encroaching winds of betrayal. In the distance, the shadows of the ancient forests stretched out like dark fingers, whispering secrets from the past, secrets that Johnson could never escape. For centuries, Dark Angels had fought to uphold the Emperor's vision, their unwavering loyalty and dedication to duty shaping the foundation of their existence. But beneath their disciplined exterior, a dark stain marred their history, one that no amount of bloodshed or victory could ever cleanse. The fallen, those of Johnson's own brothers who had turned away from the Emperor's light and embraced the darkness, haunted him like specters of the past. The betrayal they had wrought was a wound in the heart of the Dark Angels, a wound that Johnson had never fully confronted. Now, the time had come to face that shadow, but Johnson knew that confronting the fallen would not be as simple as eliminating traitors. The cost would be far higher than that. Johnson's mind drifted back to the Great Crusade, to the days when he and his brothers had fought together, united under the Emperor's banner. The Imperium had been their vision, a unified humanity stretching across the stars, and the Dark Angels had been at the forefront of that mission. They were warriors of discipline, precision, and honor, unlike any other legion in the Emperor's army. Yet even the mightiest of warriors could fall prey to their flaws, and Johnson, despite all his strength and wisdom, had failed to see the corruption brewing within his ranks. He thought of the moment when the fallen first revealed themselves, when their betrayal had shattered the unity of the Legion. He had been too slow to act, too hesitant to take the harsh measures that might have stopped it. In the end, the traitors had scattered, slipping into the darkness of the galaxy, and the Dark Angels had been left with nothing but their shame. They had fought countless battles, slain innumerable enemies, and secured many victories, but the true battle had always been within. Johnson's thoughts were interrupted by the soft crunch of boots on the cold stone behind him. He turned slowly, his piercing blue eyes locking with those of Azrael, the current chapter master of the Dark Angels, a man whose loyalty was as unyielding as the walls of the fortress itself. Azrael's face was marked by the same burden that Johnson had carried for so long, the weight of the truth about the fallen, a truth that had stained the honor of the Dark Angels for millennia. Azrael was Johnson's most trusted lieutenant, but he too bore the scars of the Legion's past, scars that would never heal. "Father," Azrael said, his voice steady but tinged with concern, "the time has come. The fallen still live, and we have spent so long searching for them. We cannot let this darkness continue to fester in the heart of our Legion." Johnson looked down at his feet, his gaze briefly flicking to the ancient ruins surrounding him. For a long moment, he said nothing, as though the words he needed to speak were lost in the wind. Finally, he sighed, the weight of centuries pressing down on his shoulders. "I know, Azrael," he said quietly, "but the question is not just about finding the fallen, it is about what we do when we find them. The fallen are not merely traitors to the Emperor, they are my brothers. I failed them. I failed the Dark Angels. And now we must pay the price for that failure." Azrael took a step forward, his expression hardening with resolve. "We have all paid the price, Father. But we cannot let the stain of their betrayal spread further. The Emperor demands justice, and the Dark Angels must be made whole again." Johnson's heart tightened at Azrael's words. He could see the fire in the younger man's eyes, the same fire that had burned in Johnson's own heart when he was first given command of the Dark Angels. Azrael was ready to act, to fight, to bring an end to the long-standing betrayal that had corrupted their Legion. But Johnson knew the truth, that the road ahead would not be so simple. The fallen were not just enemies to be slain, they were part of the Dark Angels, part of their history. And that history was far from straightforward. "I understand your resolve, Azrael," Johnson said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "But this is not just about killing the fallen. This is about understanding why they fell in the first place. It is about confronting the failure that led to their betrayal. The Dark Angels cannot move forward until we have come to terms with the sins of our past. Azrael looked at Johnson for a long moment, as if weighing the truth in his words. Finally, he nodded, though his jaw tightened with frustration. Then let us confront that past together. We will find the fallen and bring them to justice. We cannot allow our chapter to be haunted by these ghosts any longer. Johnson nodded slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He could feel the weight of the oath he had taken when he first swore allegiance to the Emperor. That oath had bound him to the Dark Angels, and now it was time to fulfill it. The past would no longer control them. The fallen would be brought to justice, one way or another. Together, Johnson and Azrael turned and walked toward the heart of the fortress, where the rest of the Legion waited. The path ahead was uncertain, but the shadows of the past would no longer dictate their future. They would move forward, and they would face the fallen and whatever else awaited them together. The Dark Angels gathered within the ancient walls of the fortress monastery, a silent anticipation hanging in the air. The Lion, as they called him, had not spoken much since the discussion with Azrael, but the presence of their Primarch was enough to stir the warriors of the Dark Angels into action. Johnson knew that he was leading his legion into uncertain territory. The fallen were not mere traitors to be hunted down. They were brothers, once loyal to the Emperor, and their betrayal was a scar that could not be easily healed. The weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on Johnson's heart. As the warriors assembled, Johnson walked through the ranks of his battle brothers, his eyes scanning their faces. These were the sons he had raised, the sons he had fought alongside in the name of unity and the Emperor. Yet, as he looked at them, he saw the same haunted look in their eyes, the same burden that weighed on him. The guilt of the fallen was not just his to bear, it was theirs as well. They, too, had been complicit in the failure to stop the treachery. Azrael stood at Johnson's side, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. The chapter master's presence was as unwavering as ever, yet Johnson could sense the turmoil beneath the surface. Azrael had long been loyal, not only to the Emperor but to Johnson himself. Yet, as the truth of their past came to light, Johnson could see the toll it was taking on the young leader. "Father, we have prepared the fleet," Azrael said, his voice steady despite the heaviness in his heart. "We are ready to move. The fallen have been tracked to a distant system, a place where they've been hiding for centuries. We have the location. It is time." Johnson's eyes narrowed. His mind raced with the implications of this mission. They would not be facing an army of traitors, but the very brothers they had once called family. He had not yet come to terms with how he would handle the confrontation, but one thing was certain: this battle would be as much internal as it would be external. "Then we will go," Johnson said quietly. "But know this, Azrael, this is not just about vengeance, this is about redemption, not just for them, but for all of us." Azrael nodded grimly, understanding the gravity of Johnson's words. The fallen were not simply enemies to be defeated, they were a part of their legion's soul, a reminder of the fragility of loyalty and the danger of pride. Dark Angels had always prided themselves on their purity and discipline, but the truth of their history now threatened to destroy everything they had built. There was no longer any escaping it. The battle would not only be for the survival of the Dark Angels, but for their very identity. The fleet of Dark Angels, hundreds of battle brothers aboard their warships, ready to face the fallen, left Caliban's atmosphere in silence. As they departed, Johnson stood at the command deck, staring out at the endless expanse of space. The stars blinked at him like distant eyes, but he was no longer comforted by their brilliance. He was no longer just a warrior. He was a man carrying the weight of the sins of his legion, and it was a burden that would follow him until his last breath. As the fleet entered the warp, the dark immaterium stretching out before them, Johnson's thoughts drifted once more to the past. He remembered the days of the Great Crusade, the ideals they fought for, the glory they sought, and the moments of triumph when they believed they were invincible. But those days were long gone, and now they were faced with something far darker, an eternal struggle for redemption. The journey through the warp was uneventful, but the tension on the ship was palpable. The Dark Angels were used to war, to the chaos of battle, but this was something different. This was not an external enemy. This was a war for their very souls. And the closer they came to their destination, the more Johnson could feel the weight of that truth pressing on him. As the fleet emerged from the warp and entered real space, they found themselves in the desolate region of space where the Fallen had been hiding for centuries. The system was isolated, far from the light of the Emperor. The planets were dead, their once thriving ecosystems now little more than barren rocks drifting in the void. It was the perfect place for the Fallen to hide, away from the watchful eyes of the Imperium. The Dark Angels descended into the system, their ships cutting through the darkness like shadows. Johnson stood at the helm of his flagship, staring down at the dead world below. The coordinates were locked. The Fallen were somewhere on that planet. "Father, we are approaching the landing zone," Azrael said, his voice breaking through Johnson's reverie. "The Fallen are close. We will need to be prepared for anything." Johnson's gaze remained fixed on the planet's surface. "We are not just hunting traitors, Azrael. We are hunting the ghosts of our past. What happens here today will shape the future of our Legion. It will determine whether we are forever bound by the chains of our failure, or whether we can finally be free of it." Azrael didn't respond, but Johnson could see the understanding in his eyes. The future of the Dark Angels was uncertain, and the burden of their legacy would never truly be lifted. But they had to face the Fallen. They had to confront their past if they were to have any hope of moving forward. The ships descended toward the surface of the dead world. The Dark Angels were ready for battle, but Johnson knew that the real war would not be fought with weapons. It would be fought with the truth, and the truth would be far more dangerous than any enemy they could face. The fleet landed, and the warriors of the Dark Angels began to deploy, stepping out onto the cold, barren landscape. Johnson and Azrael stood at the front of the line, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the Fallen. The planet was eerily silent, the only sound the wind that whipped through the desolate plains. But Johnson could feel it, the presence of the Fallen, hidden somewhere in the shadows, waiting. The time for confrontation had come. The air was thick with tension as the Dark Angels began their march across the desolate plains of the forsaken planet. The once mighty warriors now moved like shadows, their footsteps muffled by the barren earth beneath them. Each of them was aware that they were not simply marching toward another battlefield. They were walking into the heart of a nightmare that had haunted them for millennia. Johnson led the charge, his powerful figure towering above his brothers. But even he could not escape the weight of the past. Every step was a reminder of the betrayal, the mistakes that had been made, and the price they had all paid. The Fallen were not just enemies to be vanquished. They were the remnants of a time that Johnson could never truly leave behind. Their treachery was a wound that would never fully heal, and their faces, once brothers in arms, would forever haunt him. Azrael was at Johnson's side, as always, his armor gleaming under the dim light of the dead sun. His expression was unreadable, but Johnson knew the burden he carried. Azrael had always been his most loyal son, the one who carried the mantle of leadership after Johnson's own time of uncertainty. And now, he was here, leading alongside Johnson as they hunted down the very traitors who had torn their legion apart. "Father, we are nearing the location," Azrael spoke, his voice low and steady. His words were calm, but Johnson could hear the undertone of urgency. The moment of confrontation was fast approaching. Johnson nodded in acknowledgement, his gaze fixed on the distant ruins ahead. The Fallen were close. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a sense of foreboding that had been growing stronger with each passing moment. The planet felt empty, as though it had been abandoned by time itself, but Johnson knew that the Fallen were here, somewhere in these ruins, hidden in the shadows. They reached a ruined city, the crumbling spires of ancient buildings looming over them like the remnants of a long-forgotten past. The silence was oppressive, the only sound the occasional whisper of wind. The Dark Angels spread out, forming a tight perimeter around the ruins, their senses heightened, their weapons ready. Every corner, every shadow could conceal the Fallen, and Johnson knew that they were about to step into the lion's den. "Keep your eyes sharp," Johnson ordered in a voice that echoed with authority. "We are not just facing traitors, we are facing the ghosts of our past. Do not let them cloud your judgment." Azrael nodded in response, his expression hardening with determination. He had always respected Johnson's wisdom, but now, more than ever, he understood the weight of their mission. The Fallen were not simply enemies to be destroyed, they were part of their history, and that history was fraught with tragedy and betrayal. It was a history that would be difficult to erase, no matter how many battles they won. As the Dark Angels advanced deeper into the ruined city, the tension grew thick. Every step they took brought them closer to their goal, but it also brought them closer to the truth they had long feared to confront. They were no longer just fighting for the Emperor, they were fighting for their own redemption. They were fighting to reclaim their honor, to prove that they were still worthy of the Emperor's trust. The city's ruins seemed to stretch on forever, a labyrinth of crumbling walls and shattered buildings. The streets were narrow and winding, the perfect terrain for ambushes and traps. Johnson's sharp eyes scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of movement. The Fallen were cunning. They knew how to blend in, how to hide in plain sight, and Johnson knew that they could strike at any moment. But even in the silence, Johnson could feel it. There was something out there, something watching them. It was a feeling that had plagued him for years, a constant reminder that the Fallen were never far away. They were always lurking, always waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, a movement caught Johnson's eye. A shadow darted across the edge of the ruins, vanishing into the darkness. Johnson raised his hand, signaling for the Dark Angels to halt. Azrael turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "What is it, Father?" Johnson's voice was a low growl, barely audible above the wind. "The Fallen are here. I can feel them." Azrael nodded, his expression grim. "Then we will find them." "It is not way first." Johnson gestured for the squad to split up. The Dark Angels moved swiftly and quietly, spreading out to search the area. They were like ghosts, moving through the ruins with the precision of a well-oiled machine, their bolters raised and their senses heightened. Each step brought them closer to the truth, but it also brought them closer to a confrontation that none of them were fully prepared for. Johnson led the way, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the decision that awaited him, the decision to confront the Fallen, to make them pay for their betrayal. But he knew that this battle was not just about vengeance. It was about redemption. It was about proving to the galaxy, and to themselves, that the Dark Angels could rise above their past and emerge as the warriors they were always meant to be. The air was thick with tension as they moved deeper into the ruins. The ground beneath their feet was cracked and scarred, a testament to the destruction that had ravaged the planet. The Fallen had left their mark here, and it was a mark that could never be erased. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows alone. Fallen, clad in the same armor as the Dark Angels, but marked with the sigils of traitorism. Johnson's heart skipped a beat. There, before him, stood one of his brothers, a traitor, but a brother nonetheless. "Lion," the Fallen said, his voice low and cold. "It has been a long time." Johnson's hand clenched around his sword. He could feel the anger rising within him, the rage at the betrayal that had torn his legion apart. But even as the anger surged, Johnson knew that he could not allow it to control him. He could not allow himself to be consumed by hatred. He had to be the leader the Dark Angels needed. "Why?" Johnson's voice was calm, though there was an edge to it. "Why did you betray us?" The Fallen tilted his head, as if considering Johnson's question. "Betrayal? Is that what you think this is?" "No, Lion. This is freedom." The Emperor's light was blinding. We were bound by chains, unable to see the truth. But now, we are free, free to follow our own path. Johnson's eyes narrowed. "You were never free. You were lost. And now, you will face the consequences." The Fallen laughed softly, a bitter sound that echoed through the ruins. "You still don't understand, do you? You never did." Johnson raised his sword. "Then let us end this." With a mighty roar, the two brothers clashed. The air was filled with the sound of metal striking metal as Johnson and the Fallen locked in combat, their swords ringing with the force of their blows. Johnson fought with the strength of 1,000 battles, his skill honed through centuries of war. But the Fallen was fast, his movements fluid and unpredictable, a warrior shaped by the dark path he had chosen. Each strike from Johnson was met with a counter, each blow from the Fallen carrying the weight of betrayal. The battle was not just one of strength, it was a battle of wills, a battle of ideals, of what was right and what had been lost. Finally, with a powerful strike, Johnson drove his blade through the fallen's heart, ending the battle. The traitor fell to the ground, his lifeless body sinking into the dust of Caliban. Johnson stood over him, panting, his sword still raised. The battle was won, but the war within his heart was far from over. The fallen were no longer just enemies, they were the embodiment of everything Johnson had failed to prevent, everything he had hoped to protect. He had defeated this one, but the truth of the fallen was far from over. As the rest of the Dark Angels gathered around him, Johnson knew that this was only the beginning. The road to redemption would be long and difficult, but they would walk it together, and one day, they would emerge from the shadows of their past, stronger than ever before. The winds of Caliban howled relentlessly as the Dark Angels stood victorious over the body of one of their own. The traitor had been silenced, but Johnson knew the truth. This was but a small step in a much larger battle. The fallen were not just scattered across the galaxy, they had burrowed deep into the very heart of the Dark Angels. They were a cancer, and Johnson understood that the fallen could never be vanquished in one battle. This was a war that would outlast him. Johnson stood still for a moment, his armor bloodied, his breathing steady but filled with the weight of countless millennia of regrets. He could feel the presence of his sons around him, their eyes on him, but none dared to speak. The silence was oppressive. Even as the last breath left the fallen's body, the questions remained unanswered. The Dark Angels had learned to fight, to survive, and to be stoic in the face of the horrors they had faced throughout the galaxy. But how long could they keep fighting this war without facing the true enemy, the one that had festered for so long within their own ranks? Azrael stepped forward, his armored form looming behind Johnson, his voice filled with an eerie calmness. "Father," Azrael began, his tone respectful yet firm, "the first of the fallen is dealt with, but we both know there are many more. This darkness has infected our legion for far too long." Johnson's gaze flickered toward Azrael. The chapter master's words rang true. Azrael's understanding of the Dark Angel's plight went far beyond simple loyalty. It was driven by the same desire for redemption that Johnson harbored deep within. They were two sides of the same coin, bound by duty and guilt. "There is more," Johnson murmured, his voice almost lost in the wind. "This is not simply about cleansing our ranks, it is about redemption, about confronting the truth of who we are." Azrael said nothing, simply standing at attention beside Johnson. There was no need for further words. The weight of the situation spoke volumes. Johnson turned away from the body of the fallen, walking slowly across the ruined city, his mind swirling with thoughts of the long road ahead. He was not just fighting for the survival of his legion, he was fighting for their very soul. The Dark Angels had been built on a foundation of honor and loyalty, but somewhere along the way, something had been lost. The betrayal of the fallen was not just a betrayal of the Emperor, it was a betrayal of everything that the Dark Angels had stood for. But Johnson had made a promise to himself long ago. He would not let his sons fall into the same darkness. He would not allow the legacy of the fallen to define them. They would find their way back to the light. He would make sure of it. The journey was long, but the Dark Angels were no strangers to hardship. They had battled their way through the Great Crusade, through the heresy, and through countless wars. But the battles they faced now were different. They were not fighting for glory or conquest, they were fighting for their souls. As Johnson and Azrael led the Dark Angels deeper into the ruins of the planet, the echoes of betrayal rang out in every corner of his mind. He remembered the days before the fallen turned, when they had been brothers, when the Dark Angels had been united, unwavering in their mission to protect the Emperor's vision for humanity. Those days seemed like a distant memory now, a time long lost to the annals of history. The planet around them was a testament to that loss. Once, this had been a thriving world, full of life and purpose. But now, it was a hollow shell, its cities in ruins, its forests dead, its once beautiful landscapes now scarred and twisted by the forces of corruption. It was a reflection of what the Dark Angels had become, an order fractured by betrayal, their purpose lost in the shadows of their own past. Johnson's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden crackle of a comms unit in his ear. It was Sergeant Belial, one of his most trusted commanders. "Father, we have found something." Belial's voice was urgent, though not panicked. "It's a relic, one of the fallen left behind." Johnson's heart skipped a beat. A relic? It was not unusual for the fallen to leave behind signs of their passing, tokens of their dark path. But this was different. A relic meant something more. It meant a connection to the past, to the moment when the fallen had first turned against the Emperor. It was a wound that could not be ignored. "We're coming," Johnson replied, his voice commanding. "Hold your position. We will be there shortly." Azrael stepped up beside him as they made their way to the site. "A relic? From one of the fallen?" Johnson nodded. "A symbol of their betrayal, a reminder of everything we have lost. We cannot let it go unexamined. Whatever it is, it could provide answers we need." They moved swiftly, their power armor making soft, echoing thuds against the cracked stone beneath them. The ruins stretched before them like a maze, but Johnson's mind was focused on one thing: the relic. What could it reveal? What secrets did it hold about the fallen and their ultimate betrayal? As they arrived at the location, the rest of the Dark Angels were already gathered, standing in a tense formation around a small, weathered altar. Atop the altar lay an object wrapped in the tattered remnants of what had once been a holy banner. The relic itself was a sword, old and stained, its blade gleaming with an otherworldly light that seemed to flicker and shift as though it were alive. Johnson approached slowly, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what this sword represented. It was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of the fallen's rebellion, a weapon that had once been wielded by a warrior who had turned against everything the Dark Angels had sworn to protect. Azrael stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with reverence. "It is one of theirs, Father, this sword. It was forged in the fires of the Great Crusade, but it was lost when they fell." Johnson's gaze remained fixed on the sword, his mind racing. This was more than just a relic. It was a link to the past, a piece of the puzzle that had been missing for so long. It was a reminder of the brothers he had lost, the brothers who had turned away from the Emperor and the Dark Angels. "We will keep it," Johnson said quietly, his voice tinged with sorrow. "We will learn from it, but we will not let it define us. The fallen may have betrayed us, but we are not them. We are still the Dark Angels, and we will reclaim our legacy." As Johnson lifted the sword from the altar, he felt a strange sensation wash over him. It was as if the blade itself was calling to him, whispering ancient words that only he could understand. He could feel the weight of the sword, the weight of the past, pressing down on him, but he also felt a surge of determination. He would carry this burden. He would carry the Dark Angels forward. The battle was not yet over. The fallen still lurked in the shadows, waiting for their moment to strike. But Johnson was ready. He had faced the darkness before, and he would do so again. The Dark Angels would rise once more, and they would redeem themselves. For the Emperor, for their legion, for their souls. The Dark Angels had gathered in the heart of the ruins, the somber atmosphere around them thick with unspoken words. Johnson, standing before his gathered warriors, felt the weight of his own thoughts pressing in on him. The sword, still in his hand, hummed with an ancient power, its blade gleaming with a light that felt both unsettling and familiar. There was no question about the weapon's origins. It was the weapon of one of the fallen, a relic of their treachery. But for Johnson, it was more than that. It was a connection to the betrayal of his own sons, an echo of a time he had long since tried to forget. Azrael stood by his side, his gaze fixed on Johnson, sensing the internal struggle of his leader. Azrael had long known that Johnson was not simply burdened by the betrayal of the fallen, it was the weight of leadership itself that wore heavily on him. Dark Angels had been built on discipline, purity, and loyalty, but with the knowledge of the fallen within their ranks, that foundation had begun to crack. Johnson's hesitation, his reluctance to fully confront the sins of the past, was something that even Azrael could not deny. And now, as Johnson held the sword in his hand, Azrael saw in his eyes a man torn between his duty as a leader and his duty as a father to the sons he had raised. "Father," Azrael began, his voice quiet but resolute, "this weapon, it speaks of the past we cannot escape. We cannot continue to run from the truth. The fallen were once us, and it is time to face that reality." Johnson's expression hardened, and he turned his gaze toward Azrael. "You speak of truth, Azrael, but truth has a price. We cannot simply confront the fallen with the same righteous fury we once held for all enemies of the Emperor. We are not the same anymore. We have changed, and I fear that we have already paid the price for our loyalty." Azrael remained silent, understanding the weight of Johnson's words. There was no easy path forward, and every decision they made from here would shape the future of their legion. The Dark Angels had always been known for their stoic discipline, their ability to endure any hardship. But now, they faced a test of a different kind. This was not a battle of bolters and chain swords, it was a battle of the soul. Johnson stepped away from Azrael and looked out over the ruins of Caliban. The world had once been a paradise, a place of beauty and growth, a sanctuary for his sons. Now, it was nothing more than a barren wasteland, the remains of a once proud legion scattered among the dust. Fallen had left their mark on this world, and Johnson couldn't help but wonder had they left their mark on him as well. "I do not seek vengeance, Azrael," Johnson finally said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "What I seek is redemption, not just for them, but for us as well. We are haunted by our past, but I will not let that past define us. We will not become like the fallen. We will not abandon the Emperor." Azrael nodded solemnly, but there was a lingering concern in his eyes. "And what of the other fallen, Father? The ones who still roam the galaxy? We cannot ignore them. We cannot let them spread their heresy any longer." Johnson's grip tightened on the sword. His eyes narrowed as the weight of Azrael's words sank in. "No, we cannot ignore them. We must hunt them down, but we must do it with purpose, not out of hatred. We are not just seeking retribution. We are seeking the truth, and when we find it, we will make it right." Azrael remained silent for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "What if the truth we find is more than we can bear?" Johnson turned back to face Azrael, his eyes hardening. "Then we will carry that burden. We will face it as brothers, as sons of the Lion. We will face it together." And with that, Johnson made his decision. The Dark Angels would press forward, not as warriors of vengeance, but as warriors of redemption. They would not rest until every one of the fallen had been brought to justice, but they would not allow their own dark past to destroy them in the process. The next day, the Dark Angels set out once more. They had learned from their first encounter with the fallen, but Johnson knew that this next battle would be even more crucial. It would be their final chance to rid themselves of the ghosts of their past. It would be their chance to reclaim their honor. Johnson stood at the head of his force, a fierce determination burning in his chest. This was more than a war for survival. This was a war for their souls, and he would fight it to the end. He had come to terms with the fact that the Dark Angels could never escape their past, but they could change their future. The Dark Angels were not just a legion, they were a family, and in this battle, Johnson would make sure that they fought as one. The fleet of ships carrying the Dark Angels cut through the stars, heading toward the next world where the fallen had been detected. The journey was long, but Johnson did not speak much during the travel. Instead, his thoughts were consumed by the war ahead. His mind kept returning to the sword of a fallen warrior. Now in his possession, it was a symbol of everything they had lost, but also a key to understanding what had gone wrong. The Dark Angels had to face their past, but they also had to face the reality of who they had become. As the fleet approached their destination, Johnson gathered his commanders, including Azrael, Samael, and Belial. The time for discussion was over. It was time for action. "We are on the brink of something much greater than a simple battle," Johnson said, his voice steady, yet filled with the gravity of their mission. "We are facing our past, but we must not let it control us. We must stay true to our cause, to our purpose, and we must not let the fallen drag us back into the shadows." Samael, ever the pragmatic warrior, spoke up. "And if we cannot defeat them with honor, Father, what then?" Johnson turned to Samael, his expression unwavering. "Then we will fight until there is nothing left of us. But we will fight with the truth of who we are." The commanders nodded, understanding the significance of Johnson's words. They were not just warriors of the Emperor, they were sons of Caliban, and they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The fleet dropped out of warp, and arrived at their destination. The planet ahead was bleak, its surface scarred by years of war and decay. It was here that the Fallen had hidden for so long, and it was here that they would face their ultimate reckoning. Johnson gazed out across the battlefield. It was time. The Dark Angels would find the Fallen and bring them to justice. This would be the trial that defined their legion's future. But as Johnson and his warriors prepared for the coming battle, he knew one thing with certainty. The outcome of this fight would not just shape the future of the Dark Angels. It would determine whether they could ever truly be free of their past. The ground beneath Johnson's boots shook with each step as he led his brothers toward the heart of the ruined city. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The planet before them was as unforgiving as the Fallen they sought to destroy. It was a place of devastation, a mirror of the corruption that had tainted the Dark Angels themselves. But today, Johnson would make sure the past would no longer haunt them. Today, they would face the Fallen and destroy them, once and for all. Azrael was at his side, his eyes scanning the ruins as they moved. His presence was a constant source of strength, a reminder that they were not alone in this fight. For so long, Johnson had been burdened with the responsibility of leading the Dark Angels, and yet now, in these moments before the battle, he could sense the unity that had long eluded him. They were a family, a brotherhood bound not only by the oaths they had taken, but by the shared weight of their past. It was this bond that had brought them to this point, and it would be this bond that carried them through. The ruins of the city stretched out before them, dark and foreboding. Once, it had been a thriving metropolis, full of life and purpose, but now it was a shell of its former self, its buildings crumbling, and its streets littered with the remnants of countless battles. The Fallen had made their home here, and Johnson could feel their presence like a weight in the air, suffocating him with the ghosts of their betrayal. "I can feel them," Johnson muttered, his voice low, but filled with a certainty that Azrael understood. The Fallen were close. He could sense their vile presence in the air, as though the very ground beneath him had been soaked with their corruption. Azrael's voice was calm but filled with purpose. "They will not escape us this time, Father. We will bring them to justice." Johnson nodded, his grip tightening around the hilt of his sword. The Fallen had eluded him for too long, and every moment they remained at large was a stain on the honor of the Dark Angels. But now, that stain would be washed away. Today, they would face the truth of their past, and Johnson would ensure that they would never be haunted by it again. The city loomed before them, its broken spires rising into the sky like the jagged teeth of a monstrous beast. As they made their way deeper into the ruins, Johnson could feel the tension building. Every step brought them closer to the Fallen, and every step brought them closer to the truth of what had happened to the Legion, the betrayal that had shattered everything they had once believed in, the darkness that had consumed so many of his brothers. Johnson's thoughts turned to the sword, the weapon he had taken from the fallen warrior they had slain earlier. It had once belonged to one of his own sons, a brother who had turned against the Emperor and the Dark Angels. The sword was a symbol of betrayal, but it was also a key. It was a reminder that the Fallen had been part of their family, that they had once been brothers in arms. And yet, in the end, they had chosen a different path, a path that had led them into darkness. Azrael broke the silence, his voice firm. "Father, we are nearing the heart of the city. The Fallen are waiting for us." Johnson nodded, his gaze fixed on the ruins ahead. He could feel it, the pull of the past, the weight of his decisions, and the knowledge that the battle ahead would be unlike any they had fought before. The Dark Angels were not just warriors, they were custodians of the truth, and the truth was something that Johnson had spent his life running from. But no more. This battle would be the reckoning. The truth would be revealed, and whatever the cost, they would face it together. The squad of Dark Angels moved swiftly through the wreckage of the city, their bolters raised, their armor gleaming with the light of determination. They were ready for whatever awaited them. As they moved deeper into the heart of the ruins, Johnson could feel the presence of the Fallen growing stronger. They were close now, and he could sense their twisted minds, their hatred, and their contempt for everything the Dark Angels had once stood for. "Stay sharp," Johnson ordered, his voice cold and commanding. "The Fallen will not show mercy." The Dark Angels spread out, forming a tight formation as they approached the heart of the city. Johnson could see movement in the distance, shadows flitting between the ruins, figures watching them from the darkness. They were being watched. The fallen were waiting. And then, as if on cue, the ground beneath their feet trembled. The dark angels froze, their senses heightened, their weapons at the ready. A low growl echoed through the city, a primal sound that sent a chill down Johnson's spine. It was the fallen. They were here. The fallen emerged from the shadows, their figures clad in the same dark armor that had once marked them as brothers. But now, it was a twisted mockery of the armor of the dark angels, adorned with the sigils of betrayal and heresy. Their faces, once familiar, were now twisted in fury, their eyes burning with the fire of hatred. Johnson's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the leader of the fallen, the one who had once been his brother, the one who had turned against everything they had fought for, the one who had caused the split within their ranks, the one who had led the others into the darkness. "Lion," the fallen leader spat, his voice filled with contempt. "It has been a long time." Johnson's hand tightened around his sword. "You have no place here, traitor. You abandoned everything we stood for." The fallen leader sneered, stepping forward with a cruel smile on his face. "Abandoned? No, Lion. I embraced the truth. The Emperor was a lie, and we were blind to it. We sought freedom. We sought power." Johnson's voice was cold, his words a command. "And now, you will pay the price for that betrayal." With that, the battle began. The dark angels surged forward, their bolters blazing, their swords raised high. The fallen met them head-on, their own weapons gleaming with dark energy. The clash was deafening, the sound of metal on metal, the screams of the dying echoing through the ruins. Johnson and the fallen leader locked eyes, their swords meeting with a force that shook the very ground beneath them. Johnson's strength was unmatched, his movements precise and controlled, but the fallen leader was no mere foe. He was a shadow of the man Johnson had once called a brother, and their fight was a brutal contest of wills. Each strike from Johnson was met with a parry, each blow from the fallen leader matched with an equal force. The two brothers fought like gods, their weapons clashing in a dance of fury and rage. Johnson could feel the anger rising within him, but he kept it under control. This battle was not just for revenge, it was for redemption, for the soul of his legion. The fallen had turned against everything they had fought for, but Johnson would not let that darkness consume him. He would face it and destroy it, just as he had destroyed so many foes before. With a final, powerful strike, Johnson drove his sword through the fallen leader's heart. The traitor fell to the ground, his body crumpling in a heap, his life extinguished. Johnson stood over him, his chest heaving with the exertion of the battle. The fight was over, but the war was far from won. The fallen were not just enemies, they were the ghosts of his past, and the burden of their betrayal would weigh on him forever. The dark angels gathered around him, their faces grim but resolute. They had won this battle, but Johnson knew that there was still more to be done. The fallen were scattered across the galaxy, and their treachery was far from finished. But for now, they had struck a blow against the darkness, and Johnson would carry the flame of redemption forward, no matter the cost. The dark angels stood at the threshold of the unknown, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the next battle awaited. The fallen had been dealt with, but Johnson knew that this victory was fleeting. The legacy of betrayal that had plagued his legion for so long could not be erased with a single battle. It was a wound that ran deep, and only time, if ever, could heal it. Even as the dead bodies of the fallen littered the battlefield around him, Johnson's mind could not rest. His thoughts were consumed by the legacy of his legion, the weight of their actions during the heresy, and the shattered bonds between brothers. As Johnson surveyed the carnage, his heart sank deeper. Even the greatest of victories could not change the past. The fallen were still out there, scattered across the galaxy, each one carrying the curse of their treachery. Some had hidden themselves, blending in with the darkness of the Imperium's forgotten corners, while others had long since been corrupted beyond recognition. But no matter where they were, Johnson knew one thing: the war was far from over. The Dark Angels had struck a blow against the fallen, but the true reckoning would only come when the very truth of their betrayal was revealed. Azrael, his trusted lieutenant, approached from behind, his steps measured and deliberate. His armored form seemed like a shadow itself, moving silently through the wreckage of the battlefield. His voice was calm, but tinged with an emotion Johnson had come to understand all too well: duty. Azrael was, in many ways, the embodiment of the Dark Angels, driven by honor, bound by duty, and unwavering in his determination to uphold the legacy of the Lion. "Father," Azrael began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his words, "we have won, but the cost is steep. The fallen may be gone from this world, but they still live in the shadows. They still lurk out there." Johnson nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the bodies of the fallen. "The fallen are but a symptom of something far greater, Azrael. They were not born of a single moment's weakness. They were the result of a cancer that has infected our very souls. We cannot merely fight them, we must confront the darkness within us all." Azrael stepped forward, his voice unwavering. "And confront it we shall. We have always fought as brothers, Father, and we will continue to do so. But we must face the truth of our past. Only by acknowledging the sins of the fallen can we begin to rebuild what has been shattered." Johnson's eyes softened. Azrael's words were the truth, but the truth was a double-edged sword. It was not only about the fallen, it was about every decision Johnson had made. His mind drifted back to the day he had sealed his fate, the day he had cast away the friendship of his brothers in the name of the Emperor. He had never fully forgiven himself for what had happened to the Lion's Legion. They had failed their brothers, and now the Dark Angels were paying the price. "We cannot undo what has been done," Johnson said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But we can shape the future. We can ensure that we never forget the lessons of the past." Azrael placed a hand on Johnson's shoulder, his gesture firm and comforting. "Then we will keep moving forward, Father, together." Johnson nodded once, a small flicker of gratitude in his eyes. It was a rare gift to have someone who understood, someone who could help him carry the burden. In that moment, he knew that the Dark Angels would endure. Their brothers who had turned, whether by choice or corruption, were lost to them forever. But the Dark Angels still had their honor, still had their loyalty, and as long as they stood together, they would never be broken. The time for rest was fleeting. Even as Johnson contemplated the road ahead, his mind was already calculating their next move. The fallen were not far from them, and their journey would not end here. They had to press on, and they would. Azrael's voice broke through his thoughts once more. "Father, the fallen are not the only enemy we face. There are rumors of other traitors, ones who have not yet shown their face. The galaxy is filled with war, and we cannot afford to be complacent." Johnson's gaze hardened as he turned to face Azrael. "I know, Azrael. I have heard the whispers, but the fallen are our primary concern. We will hunt them down, one by one. Only when they are dealt with will we turn our attention to the others." Azrael nodded in understanding. "As you command, Father." Johnson turned toward the ruins once again, his eyes narrowing as he gazed into the distance. The galaxy was vast, and within its darkness, the fallen still lurked, but they would not escape the Dark Angels. Johnson had made a promise to himself and his brothers. The fallen would face justice, and when the time came, they would be brought to their knees. In the days that followed, the Dark Angels pressed on, moving deeper into the heart of the Imperium's outer territories. They fought not just to win battles, but to confront the ghosts of their past. Johnson's mind remained consumed with the knowledge that the fallen were always one step ahead, hiding in the shadows, slipping through their grasp. Yet, with every battle fought and every fallen eradicated, Johnson felt a growing sense of resolve. It wasn't just the fallen who needed to be hunted, it was the truth itself. They had to confront the fact that, in the wake of the heresy, the Dark Angels had become something more than just warriors. They had become outcasts, pariahs, and that was a truth that Johnson could no longer avoid. But there was still hope. As long as the Dark Angels stood united, they would endure. They would fight not just for the Emperor, but for their brothers who had fallen, and for the redemption they sought in a galaxy that was ever so dark. The Dark Angels had traveled far, their journey through the stars, taking them deeper into the heart of the galaxy's darkness. As they moved, their resolve only grew stronger. Johnson, now burdened not just with the weight of leadership, but the sins of the past, understood that the path to redemption would not be simple. It would require them to make choices that no other legion would dare to contemplate, and it would demand sacrifices that few could bear. The whispers of the fallen were growing louder. The dark angels had discovered clues to their whereabouts, and with each revelation, the echoes of betrayal grew harder to silence. Johnson's mind was consumed by the thought of what had happened to his legion. His brothers had been torn apart by the same forces that had corrupted the fallen, and now they were scattered across the stars, forever haunted by their choices. Every encounter with the fallen felt like a reminder that the past could never be fully buried. Azrael, ever vigilant and resolute, stood by Johnson's side as they boarded the transport ship that would take them to the next world. A planet on the outskirts of the Imperium had become a haven for one of the most dangerous groups of fallen yet. It was a world once known for its prosperous, thriving population, but now it had become a battleground between the Imperium's loyal forces and the forces of chaos. The fallen had been operating under the cover of the planet's isolation, but no longer. Johnson had made it clear to Azrael that they would find them, wherever they hid. "The fallen are hiding in the ashes of this planet, Azrael," Johnson said, his voice low but full of certainty. "But we will not let them remain in the dark. We will bring them to light and finish what we started." "Aye." Azrael nodded, his gaze fixed ahead, his expression unreadable. "We will, Father, but we must remember that we cannot do this alone. The battle ahead will be more than just a matter of killing traitors. The galaxy is in chaos, and if we are not careful, we will be drawn into the very thing we seek to destroy." Johnson's eyes narrowed. "We have no choice but to face it head-on. We are dark angels, Azrael. This is our duty." The transport ship broke through the planet's atmosphere with a roar, the ground approaching with terrifying speed. As the ship neared its designated landing zone, Johnson stood, his hands clasped behind his back. His gaze was far beyond the rocky plains, toward the ruins that marked the last remnants of the world's once great city. He had seen worlds like this before, worlds broken by war, worlds that had been corrupted by chaos and betrayal. This was a battlefield of scars, and Johnson knew that the enemy they sought was unlike any they had faced before. As the transport came to a halt, Johnson was the first to disembark, followed closely by Azrael and the rest of the Dark Angels. They were a sight to behold, their black armor gleaming beneath the low-hanging clouds of ash that filled the sky. They moved with purpose, their bolters raised, their eyes scanning the horizon. The scent of burning ash was thick in the air, and the sounds of distant gunfire echoed faintly from beyond the ruins. Azrael, his helmet on, stepped up beside Johnson. "Father, the signs of the fallen are here. I can feel them." Johnson nodded, but said nothing. He could feel it too, the presence of the fallen, lurking just beyond their reach. It was as if the very air around them was soaked in betrayal, and the more they advanced, the more Johnson felt the weight of the past closing in. The fallen were close, but the true danger lay in what they represented. The Dark Angels were not just fighting traitors, they were fighting the very corruption that had tainted their legion, the festering wound that had festered for millennia. The group moved swiftly through the ruins, their steps echoing off the shattered remains of the once proud buildings. As they passed what had once been the heart of the city, Johnson's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form cloaked and obscured. For a brief moment, the figure seemed to hesitate, its eyes fixed on Johnson as if it recognized him. Before Johnson could react, the figure was gone, disappearing back into the ruins. Azrael's voice broke through the silence. "Father, that was no ordinary civilian." Johnson nodded grimly. "No. That was one of the fallen. They are watching us." Without another word, Johnson and his warriors pressed on, their pace quickening. They knew the fallen were here, and they knew that the battle would be brutal. But they were not afraid. The Dark Angels had fought battles before, but this time they were fighting for something much greater. They were fighting to reclaim their honor, their legacy, and their very souls. The ruins ahead became more treacherous, the once pristine streets now littered with the wreckage of battles long past. As the Dark Angels made their way deeper into the city, the faint glow of enemy fire began to flicker in the distance. The fallen were waiting for them, and they were ready. Johnson raised his hand, signaling for his warriors to take cover. "We approach the heart of the enemy's position. Be ready, the fallen will not hesitate." Lee. As they crouched behind the broken walls of the city, Johnson's mind raced. The fallen were once his brothers, and yet they had turned away from everything they had sworn to protect. They were the embodiment of the darkness that had threatened to consume the Dark Angels during the heresy. And now, Johnson and his warriors were faced with the task of ending their reign of terror. It was not just a matter of battle, it was a matter of redemption. The Dark Angels could never erase the mistakes of the past, but they could confront them head-on, with the resolve and determination that had always defined their legion. The fallen would not escape them, no matter how deep they hid in the shadows. Johnson looked to Azrael, his expression hardened with purpose. "We strike now, let us end this." With a final signal, the Dark Angels moved forward, their bolters raised and their hearts resolute. The fallen had been hiding, but now they would face their reckoning. The shadows of the past would no longer haunt the Dark Angels. Johnson had made a vow, and he would see it fulfilled no matter the cost. The battle for the ruins of the planet was only beginning. As Johnson and his sons ventured deeper into the heart of the broken city, the presence of the fallen became undeniable. The once proud world that had once bustled with life was now a graveyard, its streets torn apart by centuries of war. And yet, in this silence, Johnson could feel the oppressive weight of the betrayal that had festered here, the dark legacy of his brothers, the fallen, who had turned their backs on everything they had once believed in. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burnt ruin, smoke rising in plumes from the wreckage of cities long destroyed. Johnson's thoughts were sharp and focused, his mind fixed on the task at hand. He had faced enemies before, but nothing like this, nothing as personal as the fallen. They were not mere traitors, they were the shadows of his own past, the embodiment of the very darkness he had sought to purge from his legion. And now, they had made their stand. The Dark Angels moved in a tight formation, their bolters raised and their armored forms a sight to behold as they swept through the ruined city. They were ready for battle, but Johnson knew that what lay ahead would be far more than a simple clash of arms. This was the culmination of the Dark Angels' journey, a reckoning for the sins of the past and the price they would have to pay for redemption. As they advanced, the faint hum of energy weapons filled the air, and the distant crack of bolter fire echoed from within the ruins. The fallen were waiting, and they knew Johnson's arrival. The Dark Angels had no illusions about the fight ahead. The fallen would not go down easily. They had once been brothers, and they had learned from the best. But Johnson and his sons were no less capable. They were the children of Lionel Johnson, and they would not be swayed by the ghosts of their past. Johnson's mind raced with the memories of the heresy, the betrayal that had torn the Dark Angels apart. He remembered the early days of the Legion, when they had fought side by side in the name of the Emperor. He remembered the promises they had made to each other, the bonds that had once tied them together as brothers. And then he remembered the moment it all fell apart, the moment that the fallen had turned against him and the Emperor. The fractures within the Dark Angels had grown too large to ignore, and now, the time for reckoning had come. They were close now. Johnson could feel the fallen watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. But this time, they would not have the luxury of surprise. Johnson was prepared. The Dark Angels had been trained for this, and they would fight with the fury of their father's legacy. They would strike fast, and they would strike hard. A movement in the distance caught Johnson's attention. He raised his hand, signaling his warriors to halt. His gaze shifted to the shadows beyond the broken city walls, where the fallen lurked. They were close. Johnson could feel them, like a wound still fresh in his mind, throbbing with the memory of betrayal. "Azrael," Johnson said quietly, his voice low but filled with authority. "Prepare the squad. We'll move on their position." Azrael nodded, his eyes locked on Johnson's face. "Yes, Father, the fallen won't escape us. This ends today." The Dark Angels began their final approach, their footsteps echoing through the empty streets. The ruins of the city were quiet now, as if holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. Johnson's mind raced as they moved through the wreckage, the walls around them whispering with the secrets of the past. He could feel the weight of the battle ahead, but he also felt something else, something that had always been with him ever since the heresy. Fear. Not for himself, but for his brothers. Fear that the fallen might have already tainted their souls beyond redemption. Fear that the darkness they had embraced would never be extinguished. The city seemed to close in around them as they neared the heart of the ruins. The final confrontation was upon them, and Johnson could sense the fallen waiting for them just beyond the corner, hidden in the shadows. He took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the hilt of his sword. This would be the moment that determined their fate. Suddenly, the fallen emerged from the shadows, their armored forms stepping out from behind broken buildings and piles of rubble. Johnson's heart sank as he recognized their faces, faces that had once been familiar, once been his brothers. The fallen had not changed. They were still the same, still wearing the same armor that had once symbolized their loyalty to the Lion. Johnson's voice rang out, commanding and resolute. "Fallen, your time is up. This is where your betrayal ends." The fallen leader, the one who had once been Johnson's closest brother, stepped forward. His armor was tarnished, his once pristine heraldry now marred with the symbols of chaos. His face, twisted by time and madness, was barely recognizable. But Johnson saw the same cold eyes, the same cruel smile. "Lion," the fallen leader sneered, "you still think you can save us? We are beyond salvation. We chose our path long ago, and now we are free. When the Sihaj, I Faldo, forces Istanols." Johnson's grip tightened. "You are not free. You are prisoners of your own delusion, and today I will end your corruption." With a roar, the battle began. The Dark Angels surged forward, their bolters blazing as they met the fallen in the heart of the ruined city. The clash was deafening, the sound of metal on metal ringing through the ruins. Johnson's sword met the fallen leader's weapon with a crack of energy, the two locked in a brutal contest of wills. Every strike Johnson made was filled with the weight of his resolve, each blow a reminder of the betrayal that had scarred his legion. The fallen leader matched him blow for blow, his strength and skill still formidable. The battle raged around them, but Johnson's focus remained on the traitor before him. "You cannot win, Lion," the fallen leader spat, his voice filled with venom. "We have embraced the true path. We are beyond you." Was a Dayward. Johnson's eyes blazed with fury. "You were always weak, and now you will pay for your sins." With a final, powerful strike, Johnson drove his sword through the fallen leader's chest, piercing his heart. The traitor crumpled to the ground, his body falling to the dust of the battlefield. The fight was over. But as Johnson stood over the fallen traitor, his mind was filled with something darker, a realization that this victory was only the beginning. The fallen had been vanquished, but their legacy would linger on. The Dark Angels had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Johnson stood amidst the ruins, his breath heavy and ragged from the battle. His sword, still slick with the blood of the fallen, reflected the faint light of the distant stars. The fight was over, but the silence that followed was far more deafening than the chaos that had preceded it. The fallen leader lay dead at his feet, his body still and lifeless. But Johnson's mind remained restless, his thoughts far from the immediate victory. His warriors were cleaning the battlefield, ensuring that the fallen had not left any surprises behind. Johnson watched them, but his eyes seemed distant, lost in thought. He had struck down one of the greatest traitors his legion had ever known, but even now he felt no sense of satisfaction, no triumph. He had always been a warrior, one who had led his brothers to war and fought beside them in the name of the Emperor. But this battle, this victory, felt hollow. Azrael approached Johnson, his face hard and unreadable beneath the helmet. He had fought alongside his father for countless campaigns, but even he could see the toll this mission had taken on Johnson's spirit. The Dark Angels had come here to hunt the fallen, and they had done so with brutal efficiency. But the truth remained, there was no simple victory here, no finality. "Father," Azrael began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of concern, "the fallen have been purged from this place. The mission is complete." Johnson turned to face Azrael, his expression inscrutable. "Is it Azrael?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of weariness and something darker, something that lurked just beneath the surface. "We may have killed the leader, but the fallen are not just a single man. They are a plague that has infected us all. Azrael said nothing for a moment. He knew better than anyone the depth of Johnson's internal struggle. The Dark Angels had always been a legion defined by their unyielding pursuit of redemption, but there had always been a shadow that followed them, a shadow of betrayal, of fractured loyalties. Johnson's burden was not just to lead his sons in battle. He carried the weight of the legion's past, of the decisions that had led them here. "We've purged this world," Azrael said quietly, "but there are still more out there. The fallen are not all in this galaxy. They hide in the dark corners, waiting for us to come for them." Johnson's gaze darkened. "And we will come for them, Azrael, every last one. But there is something more we must face, something even more insidious." Azrael raised an eyebrow, waiting for his father to continue. Johnson took a deep breath, the weight of his words pressing heavily on him. "The fallen were once my brothers. They were warriors I fought beside, in the name of the Emperor, but they betrayed us. They turned their backs on everything we stood for. And now we are left to hunt them down. But that is only part of the problem." Johnson paused, his gaze drifting to the horizon, as though searching for something beyond the battlefield, something elusive, just beyond reach. "We are the Dark Angels, Azrael," Johnson continued. "We were once the Emperor's finest, the very embodiment of loyalty and honor. But after the heresy, after the betrayal, what are we now? What is left of the Dark Angels? We are more than just hunters of traitors. We are the keepers of a secret that has haunted us for centuries." Azrael stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "We are Dark Angels, Father, and the truth we carry is not ours to reveal. But the Emperor knows what we have done, and he still calls us to his service. We are his warriors, and we will do whatever it takes to purge the galaxy of corruption." Johnson nodded slowly, the weight of Azrael's words sinking in. For all the pain, all the betrayal, Azrael was right. The Dark Angels had their duty. They had been chosen by the Emperor, and their path, no matter how dark, was one they could not abandon. Johnson turned toward the rest of the Dark Angels, who had gathered around, their eyes wary but determined. They were his sons, each one bound by a sense of duty that transcended any individual betrayal. They were the Dark Angels, and their fate was tied to something much larger than themselves. The Legion had endured so much, too much, perhaps, and yet they still stood together. They had been forged in the fires of the heresy, tempered by loss and betrayal, and now they would carry on, not for themselves, but for the Emperor, for redemption. Johnson's voice rang out across the battlefield, his command steady and clear. "The fallen are not finished. They are a symptom of something far greater, something that still lurks within us all. But we will not falter. We will hunt them to the ends of the galaxy, and we will face the darkness together." The Dark Angels nodded in unison, their expressions resolute. They were warriors, and they would never stop, not until the fallen were purged and the truth of their legion's history was known. As Johnson turned toward the transport ship, ready to continue the pursuit, his thoughts shifted. The journey was far from over, and the shadows of the past would continue to follow them. But the Dark Angels would not be consumed by the darkness. They would carry it with them, using it as a weapon. And when the time came, they would face it head-on. The hunt for the fallen would continue, but Johnson knew this. No matter how many enemies they faced, no matter the trials they endured, the Dark Angels would never falter. They had been forged by betrayal, but they were not defined by it. They were defined by their duty, and they would carry that duty until the very end.